son of Sheikh-Pul Chishti. And then it said it was written on the 29th, or a date in the Muslim era, which is equivalent to the 24th of February in 1591. Now, in February of 1591, Chunar was still in the control of the Rao, the Maharaja, the Hindu ruler of Bundi, even though it was his son who was the one who was actually in residence there while his father was off with the Mughal armies. So, the Chunar Ragamala painted for a Rao of Bundi in the hinterlands, off near Benares, but in a style which is what we would say is a very Mughal style, in a sense, a kind of provincial Mughal style, not nearly as grand as the thing certainly that we've been looking at. But if we compare it to a Mughal manuscript, this is from the Ragamala page of 1591, if we compare it to a Mughal manuscript of a few years earlier, it has the same love of things like the sense of leading space into the background by diagonal lines, by having the patterns that go into floors by either tile patterns or textile patterns or tile work of one sort or another, the kind of dark sky which evokes an evening. It comes out of that particular world, which is quite different from the kind of world that might have been going on by a painter that wasn't so interested in Mughal painting, such as this marvelous painting, again, of almost the same date, which came from a different area of southern Rajasthan, which is flat areas. There's no spatial depth within the picture. There's no sense of real interest in textures and in different kinds of patterning and patterning details. So clearly it confirms, stylistically, that here was a noble who had been brought into the Mughal system, a Rajput noble, a Hindu noble brought into the Mughal system. He was given a position off in the eastern part of India, far away from the Mughal court, but he hired two painters that had been trained at the Mughal court, probably weren't of imperial caliber, and he gave them work to do. The Ragamala, by the way, is a set. It's a Hindu set of paintings. It's a book. It's not a historical set. It has to do with, it's a set of about 36 paintings usually, which is all the possible emotional relationships that can exist between a devotee and the Lord, expressed in terms of a lover and a beloved in human terms. It's the most popular text, one of the most hard to understand, but it's one of the most popular texts in the Hindu schools of painting in India. Now, Madho Singh, not only present at that beheading, he is the man whose spear thrust killed Khan Jahan Lodi, allowing him to be beheaded. He was the man in orange, surrounded by all those beautifully depicted Mughal nobles. Where did he come from? Fine, he was given a position outside of Benares, but he came from a small town called Bundi in southern Rajasthan. And again, for those of you who have traveled in India, you have almost certainly been to Rajasthan. You've been to Udaipur and you've been to Jaipur. This is another state like that in the southern part of the Rajasthani area. Bundi is still a very, very small place. This is the palace in Bundi up here. We're going to talk about this building, look at some pictures that are in this building. Initially, the town was probably about this big here. It's spread, but it still is not a major metropolis in the way that other cities like Jaipur or Jodhpur have become in India. Let me remind you of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with rulers that came from this area around here, Bundi and Kota, who were given a governorship of this area over here. And while the sons lived here to govern this area, their father was either in Agra, right here, or up here in Lahore, where the Mughal emperors themselves were. In other words, they stayed close to the court. Now, Bundi itself, the town. This is a photograph of about 1870, a Bourne and Shepherd photograph. And it very nicely parallels a description which Rudyard Kipling gave us in a book called From Sea to Sea, in which he describes his visit to Bundi and exactly walking down this exact street at the time, virtually the same time, a few years later, that this description was made. He says, wheeled conveyances are scarce in Bundi city. There's scant room for carts, and the streets are paved with knobsome stones unpleasant to walk over. For the most part, the foot passengers have the city for their own. They do not hurry themselves. They sit in the sun and think, or put on all the arms in the family, and hung with ironmongery parade before their admiring friends. Others lean dark men with bound jaws and only a tulwar, a dagger, as a weapon, dive in and out of dark alleys on errands of state. It's a beautifully lazy city. It was lazy in Kipling's time. It's lazy still today. If you walk down this street, if you take a photograph right here, you can take virtually the same photograph today. The only difference is that two of these buildings on the right-hand side of the road here have a second story on them. But otherwise, the vistas are the same. It's one of the most marvelous places that one can visit in Rajasthan because it gives such a sense of the historical past. The palace itself, the building that was, let me just show you here, the building that's at the end of the road here, which you see up here, towering over the street itself. If you climb up in the hills and look at it, you can see the way it hangs onto the side of the mountain with the city down below. And Kipling writes as follows of this. He says, the palace of Bundi, even in broad daylight, is such a palace as men build for themselves in dreams, the work of goblins rather than men. It's built into and out of the hillsides in gigantic terrace on terrace and dominates the whole of the city. Now, if we're thinking what was in Madho Singh's experience and in his mind as he's surrounded by all those ultra-sophisticated, aristocratic people at the beheading scene that we just saw, this is the town and this is the city which he considers home. Very, very different from the Mughal court. But when we look at this and we think, well, he had this enormous palace to come back to, he didn't. In fact, this is not, there we go. If we go back to the time in which he was living, at the time that that beheading took on, the palace in Bundi would have consisted of this building right here. None of this existed. Simply a small building here with this tower, which was for flying pigeons, and a small area here, which is for members of the harem to live in. And I'll show you a painting of those areas momentarily. It was very small, tiny spaces, perched on the side of a hillside. There were none of the grandeur of gardens and large spaces and airy pavilions that we associate with the Mughal monuments at all. This is not going forward. There we are. It would have looked, that palace at the time would have looked like the palace of Madho Singh's uncle, in fact, a man named Rao Duda, whose palace still exists as a single building, which is what the original palace that I just showed you would have been before all of that accretion around it. Simply a small building that essentially had 2 rooms and a courtyard in the center of it, perched very beautifully on the side of a hillside, but it was very, very small and very, very basic and could hardly be considered to have luxurious comfort, one presumes. Going back to that great pile of masonry, looking simply at this building that we want to look at for a little bit to see where Madho Singh came from, what his home was like as he thought of it when he was standing at a scene like that. This is the palace itself of his father, which would have ended right here. All of this masonry that you see didn't exist. It's just simply this palace here, with an audience hall down here, a reception hall here, and an area up here, which we will look at again momentarily. Now, I have to remind you of another thing, and that is that he not only had, the Rao not only had a home in Bundi, and a home in Chunar, where he was a governor, but he also had a home at the Mughal court. He had palaces at the Mughal court. And in his residence at Agra, for example, a contemporary historian describes that residence as follows. He says, "He plundered the happiness of the Lord Indra. He lived here," meaning in Agra, "in his huge palace, which was decorated with beautiful picture galleries." So, these are men that moved between homes. Home in the country, weekend homes essentially, homes where their businesses were, and homes which were really the site of their work and the Mughal court, the sort of highest level of the lives that they could lead. Two pictures, another again from the Padchahnama at the lower left, and then a court scene of what a Bundi court scene might have looked like at the upper right. Let's look at this small room down at the bottom, which is that, I said it was an audience hall in that palace, which would have been where audiences were, the kinds of audiences the Mughal emperors had, which were so extravagant that you see on the left. And for the Mughal audiences, they were held in big, airy pavilions, such as the one in Delhi you see up above, in the middle of vast gardens with raised areas for the emperor to sit in, usually made of white marble, with, as we've seen in many of the pictures which Oliver Everett showed, with the court nobles arranged by rank down below. In Bundi, it was a different system. It was a small room opened out of a courtyard, and instead of the ruler of these areas sitting and mimicking at this point the power and the rank distinctions which were so important to the Mughals, they simply sat on the floor, on pillows, first among equals, but they sat on the same level as their courtiers and as the nobles that they were assembling around them. It's a very different situation. It's a very different kind of world that they lived in themselves, so that they moved back and forth between these two systems. Now, the upper part of this building, the palace of Rao Bhoj, who was one of the rulers that ruled in the early part of the 17th century, there's a room up above which is painted. And it is, in fact, contains the most extraordinary paintings that exist in Rajasthan, also the earliest and the most elaborate. They have only recently been able to be visited and studied. The entire palace at Bundi now is open, so anyone who goes at Bundi can wander through this entire structure. It's still possible to discover areas that have never been photographed and never been published, and even paintings that have been hitherto unknown. But this top room here has a very elaborate series of paintings in which there is, sorry, I will master this probably before the end of the lecture. Below, above this kind of dado of red that's down at the bottom, it has a Ragamala series painted on the walls, like that series from Chunar, and we'll come back to this in a minute. It then has a series of hunting scenes and scenes of palace life and depictions of the palace as a long frieze which goes all the way around the room. Then above that, there are scenes of the Hindu gods, other scenes of court life, and then an extraordinary ceiling, which I'll show you momentarily. The Ragamala series. I'm trying to now show you that the painters that worked at Chunar moved when the rulers left Chunar and moved back to Bundi. They took the painters there with them. What does that mean? It means that painters who were trained at the Mughal court worked outside of Benares in eastern India. Then when the Rao moved in 1591, right after, the same year, but right after that Ragamala was painted, he moved back to Bundi, and he obviously took those painters with him. These painters had invented these compositions.